we can prove that Aleister Crowley has been more influential on Western culture, popular culture, than any other human being. Now that's quite incredible because he's also the most highly regarded Satanist. And a Satanist he was. Some New Agers and some Satanists want to try to distance Crowley from being a real Satanist. However, he makes it really clear. We have quote after quote after quote who he was serving and how he was serving his god Satan. In fact, he did rituals that make it quite clear. He would grab a frog in one of his rituals and he would say, you know, "Hail under the power of Satan, I have you, Jesus of Nazareth," to the frog. And then he would crucify this frog, and speaking in the terms as though he was Satan and treating this frog as though he was Jesus. This was just one of his many satanic rituals. He was a very, very evil man. He was kicked out of France and called the evilest man in the world, or the wickedest man on earth, by the popular newspapers of his day. He talked about sacrificing several children to Satan. He talked about bringing in the New World Order under the coming Antichrist. So it's very pertinent to understand that many of these musicians that lined up after him were all about anarchy and rebellion against established government, and with the idea of bringing in a new world government.
This is Edward Alexander Crowley, also known as Aleister Crowley. He styled himself the wickedest man in the world. He believed himself to be the great beast, and he changed his name to Aleister Crowley so it would add up in both English, Hebrew, and Greek Kabbalah as 666. In 1904, Crowley had a communication with an extraterrestrial being named Iwas. And this being, through his wife, kind of a channeling type operation, brought forth a book that was called the Book of the Law in 1904. And this book declared that the slain and risen God, i.e. Jesus, had stepped off the throne, and that a new God, the crowned and conquering child, was taking his place. And as a result of this, Crowley proclaimed the end of Christianity and the start of Crowleyanity. Obviously, the guy had no self-esteem problems. In fact, he was a brilliant genius. He could play 8 chess games blindfolded. He was an accomplished poet, mountaineer, painter, writer. He had so many Masonic degrees that you could fill up 5 pages of a book with them. This guy was probably the most highly honored Mason in the world. And he was also the most dangerous man of the 20th century. And he began doing rituals to bring forth this crowned and conquering child.
One of the most notorious figures of the 20th century is that of occultist Aleister Crowley, an incredibly complex figure who has been both defended and feared. As Crowley disciple Robert Anton Wilson commented, "There is no sense in trying to whitewash Crowley's reputation. Aleister spent most of his life systematically blackening it." Aleister Crowley seemed to know from an early age that he was to serve his god, Satan. "Before I touched my teens, I was already aware that I was the beast, whose number is 666. I did not understand in the least what that implied. In my 3rd year at Cambridge, I devoted myself consciously to the great work, understanding thereby the work of becoming a spiritual being, free from the constraints, accidents, and deceptions of material existence. As a child, while reading the book of Revelation, rather than identifying with the Lamb Jesus, he identified with the beast." The following account is written by Crowley in the 3rd person. He liked to imagine himself in agony. In particular, he liked to identify himself with the beast, whose number is the number of a man, 666. Also, he would write in Confessions, echoing another theme from the Bible, man's original sin. "My eyes were opened. I had become as a god, knowing good and evil." Probably the most significant book produced by Crowley was the Book of the Law, written in 1904. It was from this book that we get the popular saying of "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," which became "do your own thing" of the 1960s. The book describes the establishment of Crowley's new eon. Crowley biographer Lawrence Sutton describes, in short, the old eon of the dying God, of a man preoccupied by his sins and morality, must be avenged by the new eon, in which humanity recognizes its own innate divine spirit. The transformation from the old eon to new must be total. Fire, blood, and blasphemy are prominent amongst the birth pangs. There will be ecstatic realizations for the worthy Thelemite. It is by the teachings of Horus that the readers of the book must expect to live and die.
I mean, it's all about peace and love on the outside, but when it all comes down, there's going to be a brutal leader that will emerge, who Crowley was forthright enough to talk about in his books, and talk about this bloodbath that would come, when Christians would be put to death. And
while Crowley taught a type of love, it would seem that this does not extend to Christians. Nature's way is to weed out the weak. This is the most merciful way too. At present, all the strong are being damaged, and their progress hindered by the dead weight of the weak limbs and the missing limbs, the diseased limbs and the atrophied limbs, the Christians to the lions. Humanitarianism, which is the simplest of the mind, acts on the basis of the lie the king must die. The king is beyond death. It is merely a pool where he dips for refreshment. We must therefore go back to Spartan ideas of education, and the worst enemies of humanity are those who wish, under pretext of compassion, to continue its ills through the generations, the Christians to the lions. What is vital to consider is the significance of what occurred after Crowley's death and who followed these teachings, wholly or in part.
Crowley had many followers. He had followers through his magical organization, the OTO, which still exists today. He also had people who were very interested in him, who carried on his tradition. For example, Timothy Leary, who people perceive as a guru, but he was also an illuminate of Thanateros, which is an offshoot of Crowley's kind of OTO and his magical practices. He copied a lot of Crowley's behaviors and what Crowley did. He attacked Christianity. He was a hedonist like Crowley. He visited the Great Pyramid of Cheops, and stayed in there much like Crowley did. He also traveled to Algeria, where Crowley emulated the magical practices or Enochian calls of John Dee and Edward Kelly. He carried Crowley's top tarot deck wherever he went. And he actually he wrote a book called Confessions of a Hope Fiend, which is an inversion of two of Crowley's books called Confessions and Diary of a Dope Fiend.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been an admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think that I'm carrying on much of the work that he started over 100 years ago, and I think the 60s themselves. You know, Crowley said he was in favor of finding your own self and do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, under love. It was a very powerful statement. I'm sorry he isn't around now to appreciate the glories that he started.
L. Ron Hubbard said he was following on his tradition. He actually started his religion or his new Age ideal church, the Church of Scientology, on the day that Crowley died in 1947. These people have a great influence on the world. There was Jack Parsons, who was the head of the Agape Lodge, which was the OTO Lodge out in California. And his scribe was actually L. Ron Hubbard. Charles Manson was a member of the Solar Lodge, which is an offshoot of the OTO. So Manson was very knowledgeable about these kind of practices, and he had an immense influence upon the 60s. Alfred Kinsey visited Aleister Crowley's Abbey of Thelema, which was his kind of the inversion of a church that he had in Cefalù, Sicily, and very dark rituals took place there. There were also musical followers: Jimmy Page, David Bowie, Ozzy Osbourne. There's his ideas suffuse J.K. Rowling's books by Harry Potter. And I haven't read all of her books, but her movies and what I've seen, the references to Flood and Sirius, these are all highly occultic references that indicate that she knows quite a bit more than she's telling to the public. And these are books and movies that have been seen by billions of people. Ian Fleming was influenced by Crowley. He wrote the James Bond book. So it goes on and on. So they're still out here together. There's a commonly understood reference to Crowley and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
I was going to mention that. Of course, Crowley appears on the cover twice, didn't he?
I think I know just once, but there's also the kind of a story about the intro to Sgt. Pepper's. It says 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play, and somebody told me that was a reference to Crowley. It was 20 years ago today that day that Crowley passed away. So 47 was when he died, and I guess the album came out in 67. So Lennon himself was a known occultist. He would constantly go to occult bookstores in New York City, and had some of his writings, Imagine, and all these other songs and stuff reference a lot of occult subjects. So
occult doctrines have led to the 1960s counterculture and led countless people down a path that has seen devastating results. Probably the greatest example of this was the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. During this time, before the rise of Hitler's Nazi Party, Germany experienced an enormous rise in occult interest. This allowed the Führer to spellbound these audiences.
The current worldwide revival of Hinduism blended with psychology and disguised as self-improvement, self-hypnosis, positive mental attitude seminars, visualization techniques, and mind dynamics courses has made today's world far more susceptible to spiritual deception than the Germany that embraced Adolf Hitler.